Now, I love Disney World. And all growing up, my whole extended family would go to Disney World every few years. And it was such a magical and amazing trip to see all the characters and just everything that's going on. And my wife, Megan, had never been to Disney World. And so this past January, we got the opportunity to go again with my family. And so we went, and it was so cool to see her face as she saw everything and experienced everything for the first time. She saw the characters, and she saw the shows, and rode the rides. She didn't much like the teacups ride. I spun her a little too fast on that one, but her mouth was hanging open, her eyes were open wide. She just loved it. And there's a reason why people call Disney World the happiest place on earth. And as we got into the airport and we were going to our hotel, we took a bus to our hotel in Florida. And on the bus, they played a video that explained how Walt Disney got his start back in 1923. And he got his start by making cartoons in the makeshift studio that he made in his uncle's garage, believe it or not. But eventually those cartoons caught on and he got on TV, and then he moved into the amusement park world in California, and then finally Disney World in Florida. And it just kept snowballing. Until now, Disney is this empire that has 200,000 employees and is a company worth $100 billion. And while Walt did have his fair share of struggles and challenges along the way, the thing that kept him going, that kept him pushing forward, was his vision. And his vision was that he wanted to bring happiness to millions. That is what sustained him as he worked hard to build what he built. Which goes to show that having a vision, having a purpose, can really help get you where you want to go. Right? And I think of a lot of other companies, they all have mission statements, right? But a lot of times they're framed or they're on a plaque and they're hung on the conference room wall. But if you ask all of the employees, nobody can tell you what the mission statement is. And I kind of wonder if that's how it's like in most people's lives. They know that there's a purpose out there somewhere for them. They know that they might have some sort of a meaning or a mission, but they don't have the fuzziest idea of what that might be. And so they just bumble along through life, letting other people decide for them what their priorities are going to be, never really knowing what their purpose is. And I want to spend some time together this morning looking into a biblical book that wrestles with this question. What is the purpose of our lives? It's a book that often gets passed by because on the surface it can seem pretty strange and a little bit depressing. And yet, it deals with this question like no other book. I'm talking about the book of Ecclesiastes. And I think that if we dig into it, we're going to be surprised by what we find. But before we do that, I want to set the stage. I want to give us a little bit of background information about the book of Ecclesiastes. Traditionally, the author was thought to be King Solomon, David's son. And that kind of makes sense because a lot of parts in the book, it sounds like King Solomon is the one who's talking, but most modern scholars don't think that that's the case. Because if you read carefully, the only thing that we know about the author is that he goes by the name Kohelet, which in Hebrew means to gather together. And so in a lot of different translations, you'll see that the author is called either the preacher or the teacher, something like that, because he's somebody that gathers a group together and then teaches them. But the other interesting thing about the author of Ecclesiastes is that there's actually two. There's two people that are speaking in this book. And it takes some careful reading to discover that. But what's really going on is it's an older father, and he's teaching his younger son everything that this preacher has said. So picture the older father and his son, and they're sitting down together, and they've got a book in their lap. And in the book is everything that the preacher is saying. And so the father reads the book, he narrates it, and then after they're finished, they have a conversation about it. Do you agree with what he said? Do you disagree? What do you think about it? That's what Ecclesiastes is. There's the preacher, and then there's the father who is explaining everything that the preacher says. And as we enter in as a third partner in that conversation, I think we're going to be surprised by what we find. So turn with me, if you have a Bible, to the book of Ecclesiastes. It's about halfway through the Bible. It's right after the book of Proverbs. And we're going to have the verses up on the screen as well. And we're going to start in chapter 1, verse 1. We read this: "The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down, and it hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and then goes around to the north. Around and around goes the wind, and on its circuit the winds return. All streams run into the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun." Now, if you've heard anything about the book of Ecclesiastes, it's probably the opening line, right? Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. Which can be a little bit confusing for us, because when we think of vanity, we probably think of someone who spends too much time in front of the mirror worrying about the pimple on their forehead or trying to get their hair to do what it's supposed to do. But that's not what the word in Hebrew is actually getting at. It's the other idea of vanity. And literally, it means breath. It's like in the freezing cold Michigan winters, when you go outside and you breathe, and for a split second you can see your breath, but then it's gone. That's the idea. That it's something that's here for a moment, and then it's gone. It fades away. It doesn't have any substance. It's not permanent. It's fleeting. And I like to think of this preacher as a scientist. He starts off with his hypothesis, which is vanity of vanities. Everything's meaningless. But then he sets out to test his hypothesis. He's going to look at the data that's out there. And so he looks around at the world with this burning question: what is the point of it all? And as he looks around, he takes in everything, searching and seeking to find the answer. So picture him. In a white lab coat, he sits down in front of his desk, and he's got a microscope in front of him with a pile of the microscope slides sitting next to him. And on the slides, he's got different parts of life that he's going to examine to see, does that hold the answer to the meaning of life? And so, as he clicks through each slide, he studies trying to find the answer. And so, first he looks at people. And as he peers into the lenses, he sees that people come and go. A generation is born and a generation dies, and nobody lives forever. This too is vanity. Click. He goes to the next slide. Next, he looks to nature. He looks at the sun, hopefully not for too long. And then he looks to the wind and the water, but they just repeat the same thing day after day. Nothing new there. This too is vanity. Click. And then he inspects the beautiful sights and the amazing music and the delicious foods. But what he finds is that our eyes always want to see more. Our ear wants new music. And our stomach craves more and more food. And so this too is vanity because nothing satisfies us. And so he clicks to the next slide. And as we continue to look throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, and I'm summarizing here, but it gets more and more philosophical, the things that are on his slides. And so next he looks to wisdom and knowledge. Maybe accumulating smarts and getting degrees is what life is all about. And yet what he finds is that the more you know, the more you wish you didn't know. Because sometimes insight can be a heavy burden to carry. So this too is vanity. Click. And next, he looks to pleasure. Now there's got to be some meaning in pleasure, right? So many people dedicate their entire lives to it. And so he drinks wine, he tells jokes, he indulges himself. And yet what he finds is that the party always comes to an end. And the smiles fade and the laughter stops. Because this too is vanity. Click. The next slide he looks at is work. Work keeps us busy and it pays the bills. But as the preacher zooms in, he realizes that we all work our fingers to the bone all of our lives just to earn what we have, and yet, in the end of the day, we turn it over to somebody else to enjoy. So this, too, is vanity. He clicks to the next one, but he's starting to get a little bit worried because his pile of slides is dwindling, and he still has not found the answer to his question, what is the meaning of life? And so he peers in and he inspects what's on the next one. Maybe being a good person is what the point of life is all about, right? But what he finds is that nobody's really all good or all bad. And in the end of the day, evil seems to triumph more often than not. And so this too must be vanity. Click. No, maybe now riches, right? Wealthy people seem to be all put together and have everything and they're always happy. But what he finds is that, as the saying goes, when you have more money, you get more problems. And money is so uncertain. It can be here one day and gone the next. And so this too is vanity. Click, 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 click. He keeps going through, and everywhere he looks, he does not find his answer. And so in chapter 9, verse 11, I think this sums up what he's feeling well. He says, "Again I saw that under the sun, the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those with knowledge." But here's what he concludes: time and chance happen to them all. The more that he looks at life, the more meaningless it all seems to become. Because in the end, everybody dies. Nothing lasts forever. And so you might as well just live it up while you can. And he ends his research in chapter 12, verse 8. And he ends it right back where he started with his hypothesis, saying, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. From his perspective, everything under the sun is just a puff of air that's here for a moment and gone the next. And I would say, I have to agree with him. Unless you take an above the sun perspective. You see, the preacher might have ended his research in chapter 12, verse 8, but the book of Ecclesiastes is not done. It keeps going because it's time for the wise father, the narrator of all of this, to speak up and to give his interpretation of the research findings. And so this whole time, the preacher has been acting like a good scientist, right? He's been studying all of the evidence in front of him. And if we're honest, I think we'd have to agree with what he's found if we only look to what's under the sun. But now when the narrator chimes in, he's not looking through the lens of a microscope. He's looking through the eyes of faith. Which, by the way, is not to say that you can't do both. I know we've got a couple scientists out here in the audience. And in fact, as the older father starts speaking, the first thing he does is he says how much he appreciates everything that the preacher has said. But he says it's not enough. And so while science can often point us to God in a million different ways, we do need a bigger perspective to fully make sense of it all. And that's the preacher's problem. He's got all of the pieces right in front of him, but he doesn't know how they fit together. Right? Think of a jigsaw puzzle. If you laid out all the pieces, and then you just piece by piece inspect each one, you're never going to get that puzzle put together. But if you set the box up, and you can see what it's supposed to look like, then you know where the pieces fit in to make the bigger picture. Or to give you another example, many of you know that my wife Megan is studying to be a nurse practitioner, which means that over the last few years I have been the test dummy for a lot of examinations and physicals, and I'm in good health, at least so she tells me. But I still remember when she was learning to use the otoscope, which is that instrument that the doctors use to look in your ears and your mouth. And the first time she put that thing in my ear, she stuck it in a little bit too far and, made me yell. What are you doing? You're sticking that thing in my ear too far. And she just couldn't figure out what she was seeing for the longest time. She was getting really frustrated with it because it wouldn't make any sense to her. But then as she went back to class and as she studied her textbook, what the inside of an ear is supposed to look like, she realized she was sticking the thing in my ear too far. And when she backed it out a little bit, she gained some more perspective, and she was able to make sense of what she was seeing. And that's what's going on in the book of Ecclesiastes. So far, we've been looking at all these different parts of life, but a little bit too close. And as the father jumps in, it's time for him to zoom out a little bit and to see the bigger picture. Because now he takes God into perspective. And so, look with me at the very end of the book in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 13 and 14. This is what the older father has to say about it all. The end of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, whether with every secret thing, whether good or evil. At last, we have the answer to our question. What's the meaning of life under the sun? It's to worship the God who is above the sun. The Father is telling this story to his Son. And he says, I agree with the preacher. Nothing on earth is able to satisfy because we were made to worship God. As St. Augustine said, our souls are restless until they find their rest in you. So what does it mean to fear God and to keep his commandments? If that's the whole point of our life, we should know what that actually looks like, right? Well, if we start at the beginning, which is usually a good place to start, in Genesis chapter 1, God creates everything. And he creates us, human beings, and then he gives them his first command. Look with me in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. This is God's first command to us. He says, God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And then, in Genesis chapter 2, we read that the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. So God's first command to us has 3 parts. Raise kids, take care of the earth, and work the ground. And since tomorrow is Labor Day, and not Mother or Father's Day or Earth Day, I'm going to focus on the last one of these, which is to work the ground. And it may come as a surprise to those of you in this room who might hate your jobs, that God's command to work actually came before Adam and Eve fell into sin, which means that work is a part of God's good, perfect world that he created. And when you think about it, his command to work the ground is really all about creating culture. Because all culture is what happens when humans intersect with the ground, the earth. And because we serve a creator God, when we create culture, we're not only obeying his command, but we're reflecting his image. And in a way, we're worshiping him. So think of the smartphone in your pocket. It's made out of glass and metal. Things that came from the ground that humans worked into something new. Or think of the art that we're going to see at Art Prize this month. All of the different art, whether it's made from canvas and paint or clay, it's all things that came from the earth that we make something beautiful out of. And when we do that, we're reflecting God by creating beautiful things and working the ground. But even if you're not an artist, you can reflect God in your work. I have a friend who's an architect, and I went to his office to kind of see what all an architect does. And so he gave me a tour, and then he showed me the project he was working on his computer. And it was a pretty neat building, but what I thought was more interesting was how he talked about his work. He said when he sits down at his computer and he's picking out the materials or figuring out the engineering for this building, he actually feels like he's worshiping God. He's doing what he feels created to do. And he feels like he's worshiping. And Megan and I actually just got to see the finished product this past week. We went for dinner in Alger Heights, and the building that he was working on is now a hopping little Greek restaurant. And that too is an expression of culture, people taking things from the earth and making something delicious out of it. So I want you to think about your vocation, whether it's paid or unpaid, whether you love it or you hate it, and think about it as God's calling on your life, that He's asking you to worship Him through. And that doesn't mean that your calling might not change someday, but for right now, God is asking you to worship Him through your work. So whether you're a mother, or you're a banker, or you're a McDonald's employee, God is calling you to worship Him through your work. One of my seminary professors, Mike Whitmer, said in his book, Worldly Saints, this all might sound kind of far-fetched, but if you've ever had a Chick-fil-A meal, you know that even fast food can be a divine calling. So don't get me wrong. Ecclesiastes shows us that apart from God, our work is meaningless. And yet, with God, everything we do has meaning. It's because Christ made a way for us to be in a right relationship with God that we can look forward to an eternity of culture building with Him. And can I just say, I hope that Chick-fil-A is part of that eternity. Yeah, amen. But until that day, we're called to worship Him both on the clock and off the clock with everything that we have. We do need to participate in what the church is doing, and we need to sacrifice our time to serve other people, and we need to share the gospel with our neighbors. Because, as Ecclesiastes says in chapter 12, verse 14, God will bring every deed into judgment, with every secret thing, whether good or evil. So we will be held accountable for how we used what God gave to us, whether that's our work life or our home life, and everything in between. And when we start to orient our lives towards fearing God and obeying His commands, we come alive like never before, because we start to see the purpose behind what we're doing. We realize that there isn't this division between our Sunday faith and our Monday through Saturday life, because everything, all of life, can be worship. And so I want to challenge you as you're enjoying your day off tomorrow to think about work just for a moment. I want you to think about the calling that God has given you. Again, whether it's paid or unpaid, whether it's being a friend or a parent or a sibling or a volunteer or an employee, all of those things are callings that God has given you. And I want you to think, how does what I do enable me to serve God and serve other people? How does what I do on a daily basis serve other people? And what does it make possible? If I didn't do what I did, what would be missing? Who would notice? What is the meaning that I want my life to have? What is the meaning that God is giving me in the calling He has assigned to me? Maybe you can write a verse on a note card that can remind you throughout the day of the purpose that God is giving you for what He's calling you to do. You can put it on your dashboard of your car. You can put it in your office so that it can be a reminder that God has me here for a purpose. Another option is you can practice a daily rhythm of prayer, which is the ancient church called it the daily office. And basically, it's just pausing throughout the day to remember God, to see His presence around you, and to see him with you in the work that he's called you to do. And when we do that, we start to live with more focus, with more intention. So my challenge is that as you go with hope and not despair, because God has called you to a purpose. He's given you a calling, and that's to worship him through all that you do. Let's pray.